I was blind, but now I see, the healed man says. Jesus heals this man and gives him sight in verse 7. And then later on, because Connie, as you know, this text is long. Later on, it keeps on going for another 34 verses after that healing. And later, this man tells a group of Pharisees, there's a whole lot of stuff I don't know, but what I know is that I was blind, and now I see. That line might be familiar. Maybe it's because you read your Bibles a lot. You know John 9. Or maybe it's because it made its way into one of the most famous hymns, a hymn that we sing not only in church, but a hymn that is sung in lots of other places, a hymn that speaks to the human soul. What hymn is that? Amazing Grace, right, by John Newton. The first verse says, I was blind, but now I see, a line taken straight from this passage. Now, it's tempting today to have us just hear those first 7 verses, because they're the ones that include this miraculous and life-changing encounter with Jesus that allows the man to see. But as we know, the story doesn't end at verse 7. It goes on for 34 more verses. And what happens in verse 8 through 41? A whole lot of bickering. So human, right? It was tempting to have us just hear the first 7 verses. But part of the point of this story is how it stretches on, how the characters circle around and argue and parse out words over and over, trying to understand something that threatens them, trying to reduce something that doesn't fit their narrative, trying to delegitimize this healing because it happens on the Sabbath or because they think the teacher is not a legitimate teacher. It goes on for another 34 verses of that. Sometimes long-held beliefs can prevent us from seeing people. Unhelpful questions can prevent us from seeing people. Biased assumptions can prevent us from seeing people. We've been talking about the power of questions this Lent, and it's true, questions have power. Questions have the power to open us up to new ideas. They have the power to connect us with people in new ways and to see our life and other people and God differently. But as we know, there are times when questions can also be hurtful, can't they? Questions can contain so many implicit assumptions that they box someone in. Questions can push back against other people or new ideas. In this story, it's just a sequence of questioning that becomes a form of resistance. In fact, the Reverend Liesl Gwynn-Garrity summarizes John 9 by saying, ultimately, it's a story about our resistance to change, those changes that Tracy was talking about with the kids. It's a story about resistance to change. The church I attended in New York City, it had a small sign outside the building, kind of like the one we have out front here, that had the ministers' names and the worship times. And then sometimes it would offer something, a thought to chew on. And there was one that had been up for a while that stood out to me that I remember. Something that included, it was a line that Flannery O'Connor wrote in a letter. All human nature vigorously resists grace because grace changes us, and the change is painful. Wow. Grace changes us, and change is painful. The song Amazing Grace, while it might sound comforting on the surface, it is not an easy song. It's about a grace that's not easy. It's grace that makes you see yourself clearly. It's about grace that changes you. You might remember that John Newton, the writer of the song, Newton was a slave trader. His occupation meant that he was transporting human beings, subjecting them to all kinds of atrocities. He was internally conflicted about it, but he kept doing his job. And then one night while he was on the boat, there was a storm that almost killed him. It led him to a conversion moment that changed the rest of his life. He couldn't undo the harm he had done. He had to live with it. He went on to study Christian theology, and he spoke out about slavery. He became an abolitionist. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Newton had to face himself. He had to face his sin. He had to face the harm he'd done. That's painful. Grace changes us, and the change can be painful. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I was blind, but now I see. The man who had been born blind told the Pharisees when they pressed him about what had happened between him and Jesus. The man's neighbors, they don't understand what's happened, so they question this man. Then they bring him to see the Pharisees, who question him again. And then when the Pharisees aren't satisfied with this guy's answers, they call in his parents, and they question his parents, who say, hey, talk to my son, he can answer for himself. And so for a second time, the Pharisees question this man. So many questions. Even Jesus' own disciples at the beginning of the story, they question this man. They have assumptions about him. In the story, questions become a form of resistance. John 9 is a story that is full of resistance. Is it change? Is change really the thing that the Pharisees are resisting, I wonder? Is change the thing that they're afraid of? And what about us? When we find ourselves resisting life or resisting other people or resisting new insight, what are we afraid of? Is it change? It could be. Change isn't easy. But maybe it's not just change or change alone exactly. Maybe it's something one layer beneath that. There's a business change guru, Ronald Heffitz from Harvard Business School, who's known for saying, what people resist is not change per se, but loss. But loss. Which leads me to ask, what did the Pharisees have to lose here? What were their losses? Honestly, it's not something I've thought much about before. But if you zoom out a bit, what's happened in Jerusalem and the surrounding area is this. The Roman Empire has stepped in, they're taxing everyone, they've put in their own kind of puppet governors, or they put in their own governors with installing local puppet governors. They have a lot of power. They let the people there continue to have their religion, to worship as they like, but the rest is under their control. When I think of it that way, of course the Pharisees would resist change. They're clinging to a system of meaning that gives them orientation in a world where so much else has been taken away. So of course they don't like Jesus healing on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is their practice, centuries, years old. Don't mess with my Sabbath, they must have felt. And of course, they want to take comfort in believing that people aren't just born blind, but blindness must come from sin. To think otherwise would be to acknowledge just how much of life is random and doesn't always make sense. They need to believe there's a sense of order to the world, of fairness and justice, even if it's not coming from the government of Rome. The Pharisees have lost a lot. That definitely does not make them right in their assumptions or in their questions or their bad theology. But it does help me see myself in them, see humanity in them. Take something deeper from this story than, oh, those rotten Pharisees, I certainly am not like them. No, this story is a mirror. It's about the blind gaining their sight. It's a story that helps us see ourselves. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Jesus gives us a story to help us see, and that's not always easy. Grace changes us, and change can be painful. Or maybe it's not the change itself that scares us or hurts us, but the loss that goes with it. Because we've had our losses too, right? Today, we're remembering the 3rd anniversary of the pandemic lockdown, a time that marked our loss of life as we knew it, that led to the loss of relationship and the loss of face-to-face connection that we were used to and that were so important to us, that are so important to us. Many of us lost people we knew and loved, people who can't be replaced. A lot feels normal again, but also in a sense, there's no going back. Our kids' education, their childhood is different. Work is different. Our connections to each other are different. Some of that's for good. I'm very glad that those of you who are viewing from home are able to do that. That's a positive change that came out of this loss I'm talking about. And there's other parts of it that have just been straight up loss, most particularly the people. We've had our losses as individuals, as society. And here we are in a church. The church, both this church and churches in general, have experienced a lot of loss over the years, over the generations. The culture has changed around us so much. The pandemic brought more changes and was one piece of a whole lot of other changes that had already begun. Some of it has felt discouraging. Sometimes it's tempting to wish for what used to be or to try to recreate what worked years ago. And I think that to clearly see a path ahead, part of our eyes being opened to that path, it involves recognizing and naming our losses too. Loss calls out to be named. In fact, we get a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations, which is a book of deep lamenting about the losses that people experienced, the exile they experienced, the disorientation they experienced. It's a book that names all of these losses and has just a thread of hope woven into the lament. There are psalms of lament, too, in the Bible, psalms that cry out to God as prayer that names the loss. Connie's gonna be talking more about that with us in a little bit. These texts call out the loss, they give the loss up to God, and they recognize that as holy. Because part of what John 9 is illustrating is that if we don't grieve the loss, what happens? Like the Pharisees, we risk not being able to see what God is doing now. We risk missing the miracle in front of us. We risk not understanding that God is healing and reviving and redeeming in ways we haven't expected, in ways that break open our resistance and our questions and that point us to an undeniable, unbreakable hope. We don't grieve the loss. We risk not being able to see what God is doing now. And God is doing so much now. God is opening eyes, and God is bringing joy. God is doing a new thing. God is giving us new friends and new voices that we heard this morning, new possibilities. God is guiding us to follow Jesus by sowing seeds, both literal seeds all around our building and figurative ones, of grace, love, and joy that we know we need